Thank you, Mr. Jenkinson. As Mr. Jenkinson said, my name is Inga Larson, and I'm a senior agricultural business major from Milesty, Montana. And of course, I'm a member of the Theodore Roosevelt Honors Leadership Program here on campus. This morning, I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. J. Lee Thompson. Dr. Thompson is a professor of history at Lamar University on the Texas Gulf Coast. Although a native Texan, he's a fellow of the Royal Historical Society and a visiting fellow each summer at Wolfson College, Cambridge University. Dr. Thompson has 6 published books, the last 2 being on Theodore Roosevelt. They are titled Theodore Roosevelt Abroad, Nature, Empire, and the Journey of an American President, and his latest, Never Call Retreat, Theodore Roosevelt and the Great War. Today, he will be focusing on the battle between Roosevelt and President Woodrow Wilson during the war. With that, ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to Dr. J. Lee Thompson.
Thank you. Am I on? Thank you for those kind words, Clay and Inga. Inga makes me sound very impressive, so I guess I'd better be good up here then this morning. Also, it's a little bit intimidating to have the man himself looming and larger than life behind me. So if he goes for his gun, please let me know while I'm talking today. I would like to start today with a quote from a letter that Theodore Roosevelt wrote to his son Archie, who was over in Europe with the AEF, the American Expeditionary Force. He wrote it on February 8, 1918. It is a very unjust world in which my sons and their wives and their mother and I have to pay for the slothful and utterly selfish ambitions of a cold-blooded and unprincipled demagogue. History may never discover it, but when this war is over, I shall write a full and truthful record of why we went in late and so unprepared, and of the incredible baseness which lay behind. Those words pretty much sum up what Theodore Roosevelt thought of Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States. And what I wanted to do in writing my book, Never Call Retreat, was give an account of the war through Roosevelt's voice, using his letters, his published works, etc. An unfiltered look, warts and all, and let my readers make their own determination of what they thought about Roosevelt. Roosevelt has widely been seen in this period as sort of going over the edge. In fact, some people believe he went a little mad. I don't take that view, but I let my readers make their own determinations about what they think about his course in the Great War. And actually, the book puts together 2 of my favorite subjects, World War I and Theodore Roosevelt, so it was sort of a perfect project for me to take on. Last night, we heard a nice overview of the war, and Roosevelt's disagreement, shall we say, with Woodrow Wilson actually began before that. They knew each other for some time. Roosevelt knew him when he was an academic, when he was president of Princeton, but really they come into conflict in 1912 in that election, in which Roosevelt basically unseats his former friend William Howard Taft, as you may know, and elects Woodrow Wilson. So in 1914, when the Great War breaks out, Roosevelt knows in his heart of hearts, although he's loath to admit it to anyone, that it's his fault that this fellow Wilson is the president of these United States. And Woodrow Wilson famously said, "It would be an irony of fate if my administration had to deal chiefly with foreign problems, for all my preparation has been in domestic matters." Roosevelt felt himself supremely qualified. He'd been to Europe in 1910. He'd met with Kaiser Wilhelm. He'd met with the presidents of France and the leading politicians in Italy and in Britain. He had backed down Kaiser Wilhelm in a dispute over Venezuela when he was president. And so it was very galling to him to have this professor, this cowardly figure in his estimation, to be president of these United States. But as was pointed out last night, neutrality, which Woodrow Wilson declares immediately, he says, "We will be neutral in fact as well as in name, in thought as well as in action." And neutrality was the traditional diplomatic stance of this country in international disputes, going back to George Washington and his famous address in which he warns us against entangling European alliances. So the nation is willing to follow Wilson in his course. In fact, he does such a good job of selling neutrality. When we come into the war in April 1917, he has to create a propaganda organization called the CPI to sell the war to the American people. Something that's often overlooked in this whole thing is that when the war in Europe breaks out, nobody thought it would last. There's something called the short war illusion. People at the time, we like to think of ourselves as all interconnected and we're all one world. Well, that was true even in 1914, particularly talking about trade. People believed that the war couldn't last more than 3 months. The world economic system would collapse. But what they didn't realize was these people, these nations had accumulated a lot of wealth over the years. And they were very evenly matched. Everyone looked back to the Franco-Prussian War in which Prussia destroyed France in a few weeks. And then out of that was born the new German Reich, the Second German Empire. But this time, France has powerful allies. And this war is not going to turn out the way it turns out. Roosevelt, at first, he realizing his position, he realizes he's a former president. He shouldn't, in time of crisis, immediately attack the administration. He realizes he needs to hold back, and he does that for about 3 months. But he also does it by November when he begins to speak out, and from that point on is going to be a vitriolic critic of Woodrow Wilson throughout the war. He has by that time realized, and as has the world, this war is not going to end. This war is going to go on. And as the war goes on, Woodrow Wilson, as an historian himself, should have known this nation, going back to when we weren't even a nation, we were the 13 colonies in the British Empire, we have been involved in one way or another in every European war that's lasted very long. If it's not a brief, short little war, it's very likely that we are to be dragged into it, and that's exactly what's going to happen. So, Roosevelt holds fire for a while, but he's seething inside. He's writing letters to correspondents around the world, attacking what Wilson is doing. And particularly what bothers him is the German invasion of Belgium. To him, that makes Germany the bad guy in this war immediately. And in fact, the Germans didn't care about that sort of thing. They, in fact, used terror as a weapon. It was pointed out last night that there were atrocities carried out in Belgium. About 6,000, the latest estimation, are Belgian civilians were killed by the Germans. But that number, although it sounds large to us today, just simply gets lost. It is a drop in the ocean of the millions and millions who are going to be casualties in this war. And the Germans actually treat the Belgians awfully. They would not have left had they won the war. During the war, they take 100,000 or more Belgians as forced slaves, basically, workers, and take them to Germany and put them to work. You know, it was an awful prospect that before Belgium. And the United States had signed, while Roosevelt was president, something called the Hague Conventions in 1907, in which at least Roosevelt believed Wilson should send a note anyway to the Germans saying, wait a minute, we signed the Hague Convention, which was guaranteeing the neutrality of all neutral nations, including Belgium. But that does not come to pass. Anyway, once he begins to speak out, he also, TR, is going to get involved in something called the Preparedness Movement. That is a movement to build up our armed forces, looking forward and realizing that if this war goes on, we are going to be in the middle of it. We have a tiny army. Our army is the size of the Belgian army or the Portuguese army. We have built up our fleet. TR was one of those who did it while he was president. But it's dwindled away to the third best in the world. In TR's estimation, this is a crime. Now, he had disagreements with Wilson going back to 1912 about politics. He also had disagreements with Wilson before 1914 about international affairs, particularly 3 things going on. There was a civil war in Mexico. He believed Wilson was weak and haphazard and couldn't make up his mind what he wanted to do there. William Jennings Bryan, the Secretary of State, had signed and was in the process of signing in 1914 something like 30 arbitration treaties in which nations were supposed to wait a year before they went to war, and they were supposed to include even what are called vital national interests. And TR believed, and in fact he lived in the real world, and he knew that when it comes to vital international interests, nations are not going to pay attention to those sort of treaties. And most personally, the Wilson administration had signed and negotiated a treaty with the Colombians to pay them the $25 million they felt they were cheated out of when TR helped to take Panama back in the 1903-1904 crisis. And there was going to be an apology. So Roosevelt saw this as the slap in the face to his policies, which it was meant to be. So he wasn't happy with Theodore Roosevelt before World War I breaks out. And then he feels like he follows a weak course. So he gets involved in the preparedness movement at the end of 1914 and into 1915. And he knows, last night he was called an outlier. He knows he's unpopular, but he doesn't care. He believes this is the right thing for America to do. We need to build up our army, even though we have a long tradition of no big standing armies, right there. And this goes back to England and the English tradition that large standing armies are dangerous. Maybe you'll have an ambitious general who might want to take over the government. Plus, they cost a lot of money. And back in these years, although we've lost our way about this today, government tried to spend as little money as it could. We've now, since World War II, have become something else than we were before. But back in 1914, we simply didn't have a big military establishment. In fact, we look back, and Woodrow Wilson and William Jennings Bryan look back to the days of the Patriots, the days of the American Revolution. William Jennings Bryan says at the end of 1915 that if there's a danger to the country and the call goes out, by the next morning, 1 million men will have sprung up across the country. Well, maybe. But TR and his friend General Leonard Wood, who's really the head of the preparedness movement in the United States, know how long it will take to train 1 million untrained men. In fact, Leonard Wood calls William Jennings Bryan an ass of the first class. So these men are pushing for this, and something comes along which changes the perspective of the country, and that is the Lusitania being sunk in May 1915. 1,200 people die, 128 American men, women, and children die. The Allies, as the Entente powers have been called since September 1914, must have been going, yes, because they figured even Woodrow Wilson, who had said there will be strict accountability about these German submarines, one of which sunk the Lusitania. I always tell my students, imagine instead of this Titanic going down slowly with the band playing in the dark, imagine the Titanic blowing up and rolling over in 15, 20 minutes, killing all these people, because that's what the Lusitania looked like. Roosevelt called this an act of piracy, and now comes one of the two things I want to point to here, which really show a dividing line between Theodore Roosevelt and between Woodrow Wilson. Roosevelt calls it an act of murder. He believes we should take action, although he's not calling for war yet at this point. Instead, Woodrow Wilson, after going into seclusion for a couple of days, comes and makes a famous speech in Philadelphia, in which he declares that a man may be too proud to fight, and a nation so right that it does not need to convince others by force that it is right. TR said about this delightful statement, in all our history, there had never been another president who had used a phrase that had done such widespread damage to the good name of America. It was one of those dreadful phrases which, as by a lightning flash, illumines the soul of the man using it and remains forever fixed in the minds of mankind in connection with that man. And when that man was the President of the United States, it was a sad and dreadful thing that the shame was necessarily shared by the nation itself and would be completely assumed by the nation if it fails to repudiate the man who uttered the phrase. If he had been president when the Lusitania went down, Roosevelt would have immediately have interned or grabbed. There were several dozen German ships in our ports that had been interned for the war since we were in neutral. Roosevelt said, I would have interned them, and the government would have taken them, and he would have said, now we will discuss not what we will give, but what we will give back. The Lusitania going down shocked the nation, and it gives impetus to this preparedness movement, which Roosevelt is so involved with. And it also gets the attention of Woodrow Wilson, who is going to come around with public opinion as it begins to come around to the fact that maybe we should do something. Maybe this war is dangerous. Maybe American lives are on the line out there in the world, and maybe we need to take some action. So in 1916, they'll put through Congress a couple of acts, one called the Army Act, another Naval Act, which will begin to grow our forces, at least in the future. This is really a lot of politics if you look at it. If you look at it closely, because as was mentioned last night, we're talking about 3 to 5 years down in the future that these plans will be put in place. They aren't going to be put in place, immediately. Anyway, the second sort of defining moment, I suppose you could say, between Roosevelt and Wilson comes at the beginning of 1917, after Wilson has narrowly been reelected, saying, as you may remember, the slogan is, "He kept us out of war," which is a nice slogan. It doesn't make any promises about the future. He kept us out of war. It doesn't say he's going to keep us out of war. But Wilson, to his credit, thinks war is an awful thing, which it is. And he goes and he makes a famous speech on 22nd January 1917 called the Peace Without Victory speech. This is a speech he's been sending Colonel House, his envoy, overseas, trying to get these crazy people in Europe to see sense. Nobody's paying any attention because they have bled too much. They have wasted too much treasure to simply make peace. Until one of them feels like they have the upper hand, they're not going to stop. And so Wilson makes this speech in which he calls for a negotiated peace. He says any peace which is made with one side's foot on the throat of the other side will not stand. That will only cause awful bad feeling which will fester and which will come back in future. And Wilson doesn't know it, but it's already too late for this. It had been too late since 1914 when he begins to offer negotiations, really. But it's now too late because the Germans have made up their mind. They are going to declare, in fact they do 8 days later, unrestricted submarine warfare. And this is the issue that's going to bring us into the war finally, so-called freedom of the seas in 1917. We've been talking about that. We've been talking to both the Germans and the British who have blockaded our ships. The Wilson administration tries to treat them even-handedly, as though stopping ships and grabbing their contents and actually paying for them, and sinking ships and killing people, there's an equivalency there. This is another thing which Theodore Roosevelt thinks is in fact ridiculous. And once the Germans at the end of January hand us a note saying the next day they're going to begin unrestricted submarine warfare, and Woodrow Wilson's response is, "Good Lord, good Lord, good Lord." He cannot believe that any civilized people will actually do this. In fact, he says, "I still don't believe they're going to do it, even though they said they're going to do it. I'm waiting for overt acts," he says. And it's going to take 3 or 4 overt acts, our ships going down. And they don't go out in February. Then they begin to go out in March, our ships. And then they begin to go down. And now Woodrow Wilson is going to be forced into the war. Now, 2 other things happened which helped to bring us in. We had many people that objected that Russia, this autocratic state with this czar, was the ally of the British and the French. And so we couldn't come and help them. But in fact, in March, there's a revolution, a first revolution in 1917 in Russia. The Tsar abdicates. There's a provisional government. That clears that away. There's also something which was mentioned last night called the Zimmermann telegram, which the British had decoded and almost gleefully hand to us because they know it will help bring us into the war. The Zimmermann telegram was an offer of an alliance. Arthur Zimmermann was the Foreign Secretary of Germany. He sent the Mexicans nation a telegram saying, "We offer you an alliance and we'll give you back those states along the southwest border that you had lost to the United States." Western people who didn't feel like they'd really been involved up to this point, it wasn't really their war. Now maybe they feel like they have some skin, shall we say, in the game. And today we look back and we say, well, this is ridiculous. How much of a threat is Mexico? I mean, we are in such a privileged position in the world, and we have been down to 9/11. We have Canada to the north, we have Mexico to the south, we have the Atlantic, we have the Pacific. We've been able to go our own way very independently. And now there seems to be a direct threat. And there had been a revolution going on, and it didn't seem so ridiculous to people in 1917 that the Mexicans might invade us because they had, right? There had been a fellow called Pancho Villa who in March of 1916 had gone across the border, attacked a little town in New Mexico called Columbus, practically burned it down, killing troops and civilians. A fellow called John J. Blackjack Pershing is going to be sent in with a punitive force, and he goes 500 miles into Mexico. He's been chasing Pancho Villa. His mission was to capture or kill Villa. He doesn't do either one. They bring him back. In fact, since I went down this road. A little sidebar here, I do that. Pershing was one of TR's golden boys. He had jumped him in 1906 over 800 senior officers from captain to brigadier general. And John J. Pershing, as you may know, is going to be the commander of the American Expeditionary Force, which is going to be sent over in June. The first people will go over in June of 1917. And Pershing wrote TR one of my favorite letters. I've looked at thousands and thousands of Theodore Roosevelt letters during these two books. And one of my most favorite letters is this letter from Pershing. Pershing writes from Mexico to TR complaining about what's going on down there, that the Mexican regular army is in his way. They won't let him go find Villa. And they're at a stalemate. And he says, looking for Pancho Villa is like looking for a needle in a haystack with armed guards around the haystack. It's sort of difficult, right? Anyway, Pershing comes back at the end of 1916, early 1917, when it becomes obvious to anyone. Woodrow Wilson knows, in fact, the Germans are building their submarines. He knows this is coming. When he makes his speech, his Peace Without Victory speech, he knows it's not going to happen. And Roosevelt responds to the Peace Without Victory speech by saying, as for Wilson's statement that there could be no real peace with victory, he tells the reporters at Oyster Bay, that so far as Belgium was concerned, it stood on a par with a similar statement, had there been such, after Bunker Hill and Lexington, that there could be no real peace if victory came to the forces of General Washington. The Washington music. If the men of Bunker Hill were right, then the Belgians had been right to say that the victory of the oppressed peoples struggling for freedom was incompatible with peace, deserved no more consideration in one case than in the other. Regarding freedom of the seas, the colonel declared that the most important thing was freedom from murder. So, in April, we do come into the war. And as you may know, Woodrow Wilson basically is there in the White House, and Roosevelt visits him and more or less abases himself, apologizes for everything, bad things he's been saying about Wilson for years, says that's all dust in the wind, says he wants to take a volunteer force, and in fact also, and this wasn't mentioned before, I think, offers to help Wilson with his draft bill. What we're going to do is follow the example. The British, for example, took them 1.5 years to put in place conscription, a draft. We're going to do it in 6 weeks. Roosevelt says, I'll help you get through this through Congress, because Wilson has a hostile Democratic Congress. A lot of the Democrats in Congress, Southerners, don't think we should be involved in this war, as do most Americans. If you had taken, there weren't Gallup polls, yes, thank the Lord, in 1917. But if you'd taken a poll, most Americans still would have said we should not go fully into this war. So Roosevelt offers his services. He had actually already organized a force for possible use in Mexico. They'd been working on this for more than a year. He had 50,000 men who would have followed him through the gates of hell. I mean, this man did, loyalty was something which people gave to him unflinchingly. But Wilson and the professional soldiers realized it would be a large blunder and don't want Roosevelt over there. They don't need a politician. This is a different war. There is no San Juan Hill to ride up. And Roosevelt wants to die a glorious death. He envisions that for himself. He knows he's gotten old and fat and infirm. He would love to go out in a blaze of glory. He's been frustrated that he's been on the sideline. His British friends have been fighting. Their sons have been dying. But Roosevelt is not going to be allowed to go. He tries for several weeks before Wilson tells him finally, no, this is not going to happen. In fact, another favorite story I have is when Roosevelt's still trying to get this commission and get to go over. He has a meeting with some Republican bigwigs. By this time, he's come back into the leadership of the Republican Party. He was an outlier for a couple of years, but by late 1916, 1917, into 1918, he is the leader of the Republicans. They have forgiven him for 1912. If he had lived, he would have been the 1920 candidate. And that there's an interesting counterfactual there about what would have happened to FDR if, in fact, TR had lived and been elected in 1920. But he's in New York in May 1917, trying to rally support, talking to all the politicians he knows. And at one of these Republican meetings, he tells them, I need to go over there. I know that I won't come back. I'm going to die on the battlefield. And his friend Elihu Root, actually his remade friend because they'd fallen out over 1912, says, Theodore, would you repeat that? And he says, I'm telling you, gentlemen, if I go over there, I will not return. I will die on the battlefield. And Elihu Root says to him, well, Theodore, I'm sure if you can convince Wilson of that, he will let you go. And in fact, if it might have been wise of Wilson to let Roosevelt go, to get him out of the way, because he is going to be a thorn in the flesh of Woodrow Wilson and his administration for the rest of the war. He's not going to shut up. He believes they've been weak in preparedness, and now they're weak once we've gotten into the war. They never can do enough. In fact, we were ridiculously unprepared, given that this war had been going on as long as it had. These poor men, the men who are conscripted, the men who volunteer, they are drilling with broomsticks. It was mentioned last night, Harry Truman in the artillery never even saw or fired a modern piece of artillery before he was sent over. We are going to wear British uniforms and have British rifles and French rifles. We're going to fly second-rate French planes. We begin famously to build something called the Liberty engine and build planes, but when the war is over, we've still only sent a handful over. Roosevelt was right if we did come into this war. But his sons, as will be talked about, do serve. All of them, Archie, Theodore Jr., Kermit, Quentin, who makes the ultimate sacrifice. So Roosevelt can kind of live with that. But he is going to be going around the country talking about hyphenated Americans, talking about the Huns within, attacking Wilson, particularly Wilson's 14 points. You may remember Wilson's, he said, the only possible program for peace in January 1914. No secret treaties, all sorts of different things, capped by the League of Nations. TR is going to unmercifully attack the League of Nations idea. He calls the 14 points 14 scraps of paper, which don't really mean anything. He believes that Wilson is an idealist. He lives in an unreal world. Theodore Roosevelt lives in the real world. So we come into the war. We are the determining factor in the war. The war is planned to go on to 1919, 1920, but it does not end in 1919, 1920. It actually ends in November 1918 in large measure because there's 1 million Americans there to help the push. The Germans are dispirited. There's rioting going on at home, but they managed to retreat in good order. Roosevelt is calling for on to Berlin. We must finish this war. There should not be a negotiated peace. And in fact, another thing which might have been good is, and people's arguments are made now about this, the world would have been much better off if we had marched to Berlin and occupied it. Because now the myth, in November 11, 1918, 11 a.m., when the gun stopped, it isn't only, there's a corporal in hospital called Adolf Hitler. He has been blinded temporarily. He was a messenger in the German army, in the Bavarian army, really. He's there crying, and so there comes this myth. We never surrendered. We were stabbed in the back. It's not just Adolf Hitler that believes that. It's millions and millions of Germans. And perhaps if we'd listened to Theodore Roosevelt and gone forward to Berlin and occupied it, they would have had to face the fact that, in fact, they were defeated. But the armistice, which is put in place, is going to be one that is going to be punitive. It basically, the Germans sign off on unconditional surrender. They agree to give up almost all their arms, their army, their navy, their air force, their rolling stock, their railroad stock, so they can no longer move troops around. So in fact, the armistice is done by our military over there, the Supreme War Council. And so Roosevelt is able to, take some solace from that. But he is prepared. They've already won the election in 1918. He is prepared to go forward and fight, keep the fight up against Woodrow Wilson. But as you know, early January, he dies. And his son Archie, who's home recuperating from his wounds, sends that famous telegram to his other brothers, Kermit and Theodore Jr., who are over there saying, the old lion is dead. And so ends this story. We have time for questions. I wanted to save 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. That was great, thank you. Just an announcement, after the session, so we'll stop at 10, there will be a book signing for Lee Thompson's book, Never Cry Retreat, out in the lobby. If you're only able to stay for the morning or even just this session, please complete an evaluation form. It's essential for us that you evaluate what you've seen, and it helps the funding with the North Dakota Humanities Council. So you heard last night, and Jeffrey Warrow resisted sort of the great man view of history. He was talking about dynamics and economics and world movements and preparedness in the military-industrial complexes of the world. And whenever he got a chance to sort of decide whether Wilson and Roosevelt really played a significant role as leaders or as spokesmen for ideas, he wanted to pull back. You've given a talk at our invitation more about the two men.
Yeah.
Where are you on this?
Well, on the one hand, he talked about economics and great forces and stuff, but on the other hand, he said he believed if the war had gone on until 1919 and 1920, Woodrow Wilson would have led to sort of a new universal peace in the world. So with one hand, he was saying Theodore Roosevelt wasn't that important, but of course Woodrow Wilson was, which I think is ill-advised, shall I say? I think it overestimates Woodrow Wilson. He didn't play well with others. And he had two others sitting there in Paris, and they still would have been there a year or two later, David Lloyd George and George Clemenceau, who were very tough cookies. These people knew what they wanted, and they did not want some ethereal League of Nations. When we got the League of Nations, and how did that work out? Right, we got World War II, and the League of Nations did not work out all that well. And one of my favorite quotes is David Lloyd George saying that sitting at the conference table between Clemenceau and between Woodrow Wilson was like sitting between Napoleon and Jesus Christ.
But
we have three very different views.
Just one more thought about that. You quoted that really extraordinary letter by T.R. After the Wilson speech in Philadelphia, where he said there can be such a thing as being too proud to fight. And Roosevelt was, you could just imagine how flummoxed and frustrated he was by that. But he said, this is like a bolt of lightning that illuminates the inner core of a man's soul. It sort of does, doesn't it?
Sure, certainly it does. I mean, Woodrow Wilson believed in peace. He wanted to be a great peacemaker. He wanted to bring the peoples of the world together. He wanted to lead. I mean, this goes back to his father was a Presbyterian minister, and it goes back to his childhood. He believed it was his mission, his duty, to not only lead America to the right, to the promised land, but also to the world, finally. And I mentioned righteousness is another word which I meant to say something about. One of Roosevelt's famous verses is "Do right and follow in the path of the Lord," something like that. Righteousness is a word we don't hear from our politicians very much these days. But these people believed in that sort of thing. There was a moral component 100 years ago that simply doesn't exist anymore. Although our president has recently said there's evil in the world and we need to do something about it. There are real parallels. One of the things that caught my attention in this project was, I mean, think about it. We have a Democratic president with a collegiate background, a great speaker who offers hope and change and promise to us. He's attacked by a partisan opposition unmercifully. Sound familiar? You could be talking about either Obama and John McCain or others who were mentioned, or you could be talking about 1914 and Woodrow Wilson. So the more things change, as they say.
Questions for Professor Thompson? Yes, here?
The final bit is, do I think that T.R. resented the sort of academic view that was carried out by Wilson? Yeah, he saw Wilson as this cold-blooded rhetorician who had these nice theories, but T.R. lived in the real world. Right? And there was, along the lines of what you're saying, there's a famous book published 30 years or so ago by John Milton Cooper called The Warrior and the Priest. And I would say that if I wrote that book, I would say, the prophet and the priest, because I see Roosevelt as almost sort of an Old Testament prophet. He was an Old Testament sort of guy. That verse of his is from the Old Testament, and Woodrow Wilson was more New Testament love and Christ, and he along with William Jennings Bryan. So yeah.
But Roosevelt was an intellectual too. But he believed that an intellectual must act, and I think, didn't he find Wilson to be, from his using his terminology, effeminate in action?
Yeah. In fact, there's a famous quote, elocution as a substitute for action also illuminated Wilson's soul. And righteousness divorced from force was utterly futile, he said.
Other questions? Yes, here.
Yeah,
The second Mrs. Wilson.
Yeah, the second Mrs. Wilson, for months. Dr. Grayson, his doctor, and his wife, I think who also called Edith, like Roosevelt's wife. Wilson had a stroke. He couldn't even communicate, really. That would never happen today, but for months.
This was after the war.
Yeah, this is after the war. This is when he goes out to sell the League of Nations and the Versailles Treaty, which, by the way, we never ratify the Versailles Treaty. We officially end World War I in the Harding administration by joint resolution of Congress. We never joined the League of Nations, which really hamstrings it all. Although we withdraw, the United States, in the 1920s, after World War II, we become this military-industrial complex, and we have become the policemen of the world. Well, after World War I, we withdraw into something called isolationism. That's what the diplomatic historians call it anyway. We don't get involved, which is what our traditional policy had been. Our traditional policy, going back to Washington, had been neutrality, stick to our own knitting. We were in this protected position, which allowed us to, we had our own empire here in the 48 states.
It's worth noting that the first Mrs. Wilson died just as
Yeah.
the war began,
Yep.
and his grief was overpowering.
Sure.
So that has to be factored in his responses, doesn't it?
Sure, I mean, that had something to do with it, but I don't know that his response would have been a lot different. Really?
Other questions? Yes, here.
Mm-hmm.
Writing differences.
Well, difference. Wilson's probably, more academically oriented. TR went out into the real world, went to the West, did all sorts of different things. I'm probably prejudiced, but since I spent so many years with the man, but I prefer Roosevelt's writing. And speaking of the academic thing, I mean, if Harvard had had a more outdoors biology program, he could have been, TR, as you probably know, an academic himself. But instead, he goes the other way. He definitely was an intellectual. Spoke several languages. When he went overseas, he spoke German and French to these people.
He's a much more straightforward writer and simpler sentence structure.
Yeah.
More earthy, more action.
He makes a comment at one point about a beautiful, polished diction that Woodrow Wilson used, and that's sort of in his speech writing and his writing in general. Yeah.
He called him a professional rhetorician.
Yeah.
Yes. Guilt turned to projection.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I would agree. I would agree with that. This man is a Victorian, after all, in many ways. I actually disagree a little bit with those who have been riding this hobby horse about his father not serving in the Civil War being so tremendously important. I think it was a factor, but I would tend to actually not give as much importance to it as has been given by a lot of people. I don't know, just my own take on things. I can't give you any sort of logical argument.
But you all know his father bought his way out of the Civil War and hired proxies.
And that's been long used to
as a justification for
what
his
he does,
heroics. A couple more if we have time. Yes?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, what did you mean by if TR is elected in 1920, what happens to FDR?
Well, you may know FDR first comes to national prominence in 1920. He's the vice presidential candidate on the Democratic ticket. Why is he there? He's there for his name to a large extent. They know Roosevelt is dead. There's still a lot of popularity for Roosevelt out there, and I think they hope they can play. That will play. He also did his bit in the war, and FDR on purpose followed the path of TR, except for staying in Washington. He didn't go and fight. People told him not to go. That wouldn't be a smart thing to do, although TR does give Eleanor a hard time about that.
But,
Right.
I mean, if TR is elected in 1920...
Yeah, if he's
then-
elected in 1920, whereas he would have put in fact, he had an agenda, he had a program, which had amongst its listed things, many things which are going to be in the New Deal in the 1930s. Now, the problem would have been, in the 1920s, Harding gets elected because he rides a wave. There is this idea about normalcy, and people are tired of reform. They're tired. The progressives have been around for 20 years. They're tired of all that. They've just lived through this war, and even though we only got a small taste of it, we see it as this awful thing. We need to be doing something else. So TR might have had this platform, but I think he would have had a hell of a time, even TR, getting it through the Congress. That would have been interesting to see. I mean, if you want to play the complete counterfactual game. But he might have stolen the clothes of FDR just the way Woodrow Wilson steals his clothes when he becomes president.
They might have displaced him altogether.
Yeah, it's displaced him, and so where would FDR have been? He would have had to sort of reinvent himself, which he might have been capable of doing because he was a pretty good politician himself. And they were friends. I mean, it's interesting that the one's a Democrat and the one's a Republican, but they're great friends, and TR helps FDR as much as he can, and FDR feeds him. He's Assistant Secretary of the Navy during the war, and he's feeding him and other people information about what's going on inside the administration. He's sort of a spy.
He's a somewhat disloyal Assistant Secretary
from
of the
that
Navy.
point of view. But he thinks Josephus Daniel is a complete boob, I think. his chief, the Secretary of the Navy, was called Josephus Daniel.
Is there a last question at this moment? Yeah. How would our public have reacted if we had sustained losses in the war?
I think there would have been support for a while, and then there might have been a negotiated peace. But I think us being there, since they were so evenly matched, if we had got 1 million or 2 million troops on the ground, I think we would have tipped the balance. I don't think the war would have gone on endlessly. Yeah, but both sides were wearing down. I don't know. When do you mean we come in? If we come in right at the beginning, or we come in just a little earlier than we did? Yeah.
Mid-war.
Yeah, I mean, well, that's an impossible thing to say, but my inclination would be to say that we would have been tipped the balance, because that's both sides, wanted our support. The Germans knew. In fact, the reason they carry out unrestricted submarine warfare is they know we don't have an army. We can't get it over there very soon.
Let me ask you a last question, then we have to take our break, and you'll sign books, which
Okay.
is great. But you've now been working on Roosevelt, 2 books, and maybe a third coming. You've published this book, Never Cry Retreat, about Roosevelt in World War I. And so you've seen this man who sometimes was regarded as a loose cannon or an outlier or even mad by some. Mm-hmm. As you go through all of this and really look at his Outlook articles and his Metropolitan articles in Kansas City Star, does your admiration, I mean, I know you want to withhold judgment, you started that way, but you had to have some attitudinal processing of him. What do you feel about him when you see this era of his life?
I feel he didn't have to filter himself because he wasn't president, so he's going to be more open, and he's able to say openly things that he couldn't have said. When you're president, you have to compromise, and he was a very good politician, and he knew all that. So he is able to openly say what he thinks, and if you look at what he's suggesting, the course that he thinks the country should follow, I think it would have been a wise course to follow.
So, last night, Dr. Walrus said he was really just sort of bombastic and a nuisance, but he's sort of borne out in your mind.
No. In fact, I can say 2 things about his impact. Because of him, we are, at least in April 1917, have the preconditions in place to prepare. Without that, we wouldn't have had that.
So he set the table for that.
He sets the table for that. And he sets the table for us sending over some troops, something I should have said, I suppose, when I was talking about him demanding to go. Wilson signs the draft in place and says, no, we're not going to send volunteers. We're going to send conscripted soldiers. Your volunteer idea is really nice. And a bill goes through Congress which allows volunteer divisions, but it leaves it up to Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson says, no, not right now. We're not going to send troops right now. And Woodrow Wilson did not want to send troops. He wanted us to use money and ships, just the same way the British did at the beginning of the war, instead of sending manpower. So we're going to send over Pershing and 25,000 guys or so immediately. We're going to begin to train up troops, and then 100,000 a month they're going to come, and we're going to use that as propaganda. We're going to be firing leaflets over the enemy lines saying, Look at this graph of all the Americans coming. How many troops do you have, fresh troops, that are going to come in now, right? Propaganda works, and my first book was about this. Propaganda works on people who are tired, on people who want to quit. They want an excuse to lay down their rifles and stop. And so he's able to use the 14 points, which basically said self-determination. We'll let you people, particularly in Austria-Hungary, have your own nations. Right? Our fight isn't with you. It's with this Kaiser. It's with this emperor. Right? And that's going to be very persuasive. And Roosevelt helps, I think.
And finally, you know, when Roosevelt goes hat in hand to Wilson in April and begs him essentially to let him raise one last group of Rough Riders and lead the charge into France.
Yep.
I know you're looking at it as a historian, but you're also looking at it as an admirer of Roosevelt. I know I have this feeling. You just want to say, oh, come on, Wilson, just let him do it, don't you?
Yeah, and you know, leaders in Europe, for example, Georges Clemenceau, who's going to be the premier of France by the end of 1970, he'd been before, says, send us Roosevelt. Nothing would be better for our morale, and it would have helped their morale. I think it would have been a good. Instead, his son, instead of TR getting bouquets thrown at him, you know, marching through Paris, famously, then going to the Picpus Cemetery and saying, Lafayette, we are here, you know. Roosevelt, instead, it's Theodore who's there.
Professor Lee Thompson, thank you.